In this chapter, I'll show you another technique that's inspired by Nick Page, and this one softens both dark tones and light tones in the image, creating a soft contrast decrease. Tony's created an action for it in the Workflow Extras interface of the Multimask module, right here called Shadow Lift Haze. When you run the action, it creates a merged layer that's blurred, and it sets a default radius for the blur, which I usually just go with that. And it loads a Darks 1 luminosity mask as a selection and places a black mask on the layer. This sets you up to paint the effect into dark areas to slightly lighten and soften them. Note that this adjustment doesn't bring out shadow detail. So if shadow detail is what you're after, this isn't the right adjustment for that. That would be better done with the shadow and black sliders in Lightroom or Camera Raw, or maybe dodging the shadows, or using the focus clarity technique that I showed you in chapter 4. But to apply this soft shadow lift, let's zoom in to this dark area over here. And you can see that when I paint through the luminosity selection with the white brush, it just slightly lifts or softens those dark areas. And if instead of a darks mask as a selection, if we went and grabbed a lights luminosity mask as a selection and painted in light areas, we can also use it to slightly darken and soften highlights. So that's one good use for that action. But what I really like using this adjustment for is distance haze, which makes distant objects feel even further away, and that enhances the sense of image depth. In this image, the atmosphere is already creating a lot of distance haze, so it naturally has that sense of depth. But if I run the action, and then paint onto the black mask through that darks luminosity mask, I can make the distance haze effect even stronger. Another way to apply this adjustment is with a depth mask, which progressively applies the adjustment the further back you go into the scene. A depth map isn't a luminosity mask, so it's technically outside the scope of this course, but I figured you wouldn't mind learning how to use them. It is possible to make depth maps just using Photoshop, but fortunately for us, the TK plugin makes it much easier. To apply the distance haze with a depth map, you start the same way by creating the Shadow Lift Distance Haze layer from Workflow Extras. Then we get out of Workflow Extras, and we want to go into the Focus Mask interface, but we want to go into the depth map part of it, and to do that, you hold down the Control or the Command key when you click on this button. And that generates a depth map. Notice that in the depth map, things that are the closest are dark, so the adjustment will be concealed up close. And as you go further back into the image, things get lighter. So the further away things are, the more of that distance haze adjustment will be revealed. We need to save this depth map as a channel. You have the option now to save both this depth map and the inverse of the depth map, so saving 2 channels. But for this effect, we only need the one channel, the one we're looking at. So I'll just click this button and save it. And that saves it here in the channels panel right there. Now we need to load that depth map into Multimask so we can apply it to the haze layer. So I'll go to My Channels and then select the depth map, and that loads it into Multimask. And I also want to modify it a bit. I want to come to Curves to modify, and I want this foreground area to be totally black. So I don't want any of the adjustment going to that foreground area. And I want even more of it going to these mountains in the distance. So I'll click and make those lighter in the mask. And I notice a couple of these little tips of the mountains didn't get included in the mask. I can just grab the white brush really quick and just kind of lighten those to make sure they get the same amount of adjustment as the rest. All right, something like that will probably be fine. Now I just need to output this depth map to that layer, which you do with the apply button right here in the output section. And there it is. And now we are just applying that depth haze to the mountains in the background and creating that sense of distance and dimension in the image. And it's not a luminosity mask, so it's being applied globally back there. So if I did want to mask it out of the highlights so that the highlights aren't being dulled as much, I could just load a lights luminosity selection, maybe go for yellows so it really targets those highlights. Load that as a selection, grab a black brush, and now I can just paint that out of the highlights to bring some of the highlights back a little stronger. And while it works great on mountains, you can use it on other scenes as well. For example, forest scenes, where I might want the forest to feel like it's receding more into the distance. The process would be to come to Workflow Extras, create the haze layer, and now get out of Workflow Extras, Control Command click to go to Depth Map, save the depth map as a channel, go to My Channels and load it into Multi-Mask. And then I'm going to actually check like the lights 2 or the lights 3. Yeah, that really starts to target what I want. And I could even do additional mask contrast if I wanted to really dial it into just that area. And now I just need to apply it to that layer with the apply button. And there is that depth haze going into the back, making it seem a little further away back there. Now, if I wanted to paint it out of maybe like the waterfall and some of the leaves, I could grab a lights mask, load it as a selection, grab a black brush, and use that to paint the mask and paint it out of any highlights that I don't want to be softened. So before, after, before, after. All right, let's try it on one last forest image. This is kind of similar to the last one, but I just really like the effect. So same thing, come into Workflow Extras, run the haze action, get out of Workflow Extras, Control Command click for the depth mask interface, save the depth map as a channel, come to My Channels and load it. I only want to apply it in the very back part of the image back here. So let's check like a 2 or lights 3. Yeah, that's looking good. And I'm going to modify it even a little bit more. Darken this foreground area, lighten back here. And you'll notice there is a little banding in some of these depth maps, but that's okay because this soft haze that we're putting in won't create any banding, even though there's some banding in the mask. So apply it and let's take a look. Yeah, there's that slight haze in the background that just gives this image the feeling of distance back into the forest. Combining distance haze with luminosity painting techniques allows you to create images that feel like the viewer could almost walk right into them. That brings us to the end of this advanced course on luminosity masks. I hope these techniques have expanded your understanding of how to refine your image editing with greater precision and creativity. Whether it's customizing masks, split toning, clarity adjustments, or luminosity painting, the possibilities are vast when you have the right tools and knowledge. Remember, these techniques are all about giving you more control and flexibility in your workflow, so feel free to experiment and adapt them to suit your style. If you ever need to revisit any foundational concepts, the Luminosity Mask Basic course is there for a refresher. And don't forget the final course in this series, Exposure Blending, available in January 2025, will cover my latest techniques which I've arrived at after 20 years of practice. Thanks as always for joining me. Have fun applying these skills in your work. Enjoy your photography, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.